I was camping alone in a valley far from anything familiar. No cell service, no nearby towns, no other vehicles once the sun started dropping. It was one of those places where the road narrowed into gravel, then dirt, then nothing that felt official anymore. Steep hills rose on both sides, covered in dry brush and scattered trees. A river cut through the bottom of the valley, slow and brown, making a constant low sound that never fully faded. The kind of place where sound carried in strange ways and time felt stretched. I had planned to hike most of the day and camp wherever I ended up. I stayed on the trail longer than I meant to. The light changed before I realized how late it had gotten. Shadows started pooling in the low spots. The air cooled fast. That was when I ran into a local guy coming the opposite direction. He looked normal enough. Calm. Friendly. He asked where I was headed and mentioned a camping spot close by that most people missed. He said it was near the road and the river, but hidden well enough that you wouldn't see it unless you knew it was there. I didn't feel any alarm. I was tired, and the idea of an easy spot sounded good. He walked me part of the way and pointed it out. From the road, it looked like nothing. Just brush and uneven ground. But once you stepped through, it opened into a flat pocket with space for a fire and a vehicle. I thanked him, and he left the way he came. I watched until he disappeared into the trees. Everything felt quiet again. I set up my camp fast. I made a fire as the last of the daylight drained out of the valley. The flames threw long shadows across the rocks and low branches. I cracked open a beer, then another. I played a comedy podcast from a small speaker. It felt good to laugh out there, even if no one else could hear it. I was loud. Anyone nearby would have known exactly where I was. The firelight made me visible from every angle. I didn't care. I felt relaxed, loose, comfortable. I thought about setting up my tent, but it was already dark and I didn't feel like dealing with stakes and uneven ground. Instead, I climbed into the back of my truck onto the topper. I laid my sleeping bag out next to my gear and locked the tailgate from the inside. It felt lazy, but also easy. I drifted off with the sound of the river and the fire popping outside. The night passed without anything I remember clearly. No dreams that stuck. No sounds that jolted me awake. Just darkness and sleep. When I woke up, the light was already filtering through the dusty windows of the topper. Morning in the valley felt still. The air was cool. The fire from the night before had burned down to ash. I climbed out, stretched, and started another fire. I opened a beer without really thinking about it, and set water on to heat. The routine felt familiar and grounding. The valley looked peaceful in the daylight. Birds moved through the brush. The river reflected pale light. I felt safe enough that my guard was down. That was when I noticed movement at the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light or a branch shifting in the breeze. Then I realized it was a person standing just beyond where the ground dropped off toward the river. He was close enough that I should have heard him approach, but I hadn't. That realization hit me harder than the sight of him. He stood still at first, facing slightly away from me. He was thin and dirty, wearing layers of mismatched clothes. His beard was long and tangled, hanging down his chest. Plastic grocery bags were tied all over him, around his waist, over his shoulders, hanging from his arms. Dozens of them, maybe more. They shifted and rustled when he moved, making a dry, unnatural sound. I acknowledged him in a casual way, commenting on the morning and the weather, trying to keep things light. He didn't react. He didn't look at me. He didn't answer. He stayed where he was, staring off to the side like I wasn't there. After a moment, he started moving. Slowly, he walked a loose circle around the edge of my camp, never stepping fully into it. He kept his back or his shoulder turned toward me. The plastic bags brushed against each other with every step. The sound crawled under my skin. I offered him food. I gestured toward the fire in the pan. No response. His pace didn't change. He just kept moving, stopping now and then starting again. He never made eye contact. Not once. I felt the shift inside myself when I realized this wasn't going to turn into anything normal. There was no exchange happening. No acknowledgement. Just presence. Just him occupying the space around me without engaging. My stomach tightened. The valley suddenly felt smaller. The trees felt closer. I offered him a beer, holding it out where he could see it. He stopped moving for a moment, then turned his body slightly farther away and resumed pacing. The gesture felt pointless as soon as I made it. I checked my gear without making it obvious. My bear spray was within arm's reach. My knife was right there too. I positioned myself so I could grab either without fumbling. My heart rate climbed, steady and heavy. I kept watching his hands. They stayed low, empty as far as I could tell, but the bags obscured everything. I made it clear with my posture and my movement that I needed him to either acknowledge me or leave. I raised my voice. He ignored it completely. No reaction, no change in behavior. It was like I was speaking into a void. That was the moment the fear fully settled in. Not panic, not yet, but certainty. The certainty that there was no good outcome if this continued. No misunderstanding to clear up. No social cue to fix. Just a man standing too close, acting like I didn't exist while clearly watching everything. I grabbed the bear spray and stepped toward him, closing some of the distance. The sound of my boots on the ground felt loud. The fire popped behind me. The river kept flowing, indifferent. I held the spray up where he could see it. He stopped. The bag swayed as he turned his head slightly. Still no eye contact. Then he slouched, shoulders dropping, and walked away toward the brush. His pace was slow, almost lazy, like he had all the time in the world. The plastic bags whispered against each other until the sound faded into the trees. I stood there for several seconds after he disappeared, waiting to see if he would come back. He didn't. The clearing felt wrong now. Tainted. Every shadow looked like movement. Every sound from the brush made my muscles tense. I didn't finish breakfast. I didn't put the fire out properly. I threw my gear into the truck, hands shaking enough that I dropped things more than once. I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine without a second thought. I pulled out fast, gravel spraying, heart hammering the whole way back to the road. As I drove out of the valley, one thought kept repeating. The way he had appeared without sound. The way he already knew where my camp was. The way he stayed at the edge, just watching, just waiting. I thought about the fire the night before. The laughter from the speaker. How visible I had been. How easy it would have been to watch me from the dark. I thought about the tent I never set up. How thin the walls would have been. How exposed I would have been sleeping on the ground. I realized my laziness might have saved me from something I didn't want to imagine fully. I never went back to that spot. I never camped alone in a place that isolated again. That morning taught me that danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just stands there quietly, refusing to acknowledge you, waiting to see what you do next. I went camping alone in a stretch of bushland that sat well off the main road, the kind of place locals use for day walks, but rarely stayed overnight. It wasn't deep wilderness, but it felt cut off once the light dropped. The ground was dry and uneven, layered with sticks, bark, and old leaf litter that snapped underfoot. Every step made noise. That was part of why I chose it. I liked knowing I'd hear anything moving nearby, animal or human. It made me feel alert, in control. I arrived in the late afternoon. The sun filtered through tall gums, turning the dust in the air gold. Kangaroo tracks crossed the open patches of dirt. I saw droppings everywhere, dark and dry. The place smelled like eucalyptus and warm earth. I picked a flat spot between a few trees, cleared loose branches, and set up my tent. I paid attention to my surroundings, noting where the trees were dense and where the bush thinned out. Nothing felt wrong. Nothing stood out. As evening settled in, the bush grew louder in a familiar way. Insects buzzed. Birds called to each other before going quiet. Somewhere off in the distance, something large moved through scrub, heavy and slow. I assumed kangaroos. The sound carried clearly through the dry ground cover. That crunching pattern was constant, predictable. It didn't bother me. I cooked a simple meal on a small stove and ate sitting on a log. The light drained fast once the sun dipped behind the trees. Shadows thickened until everything beyond my small clearing blurred together. I turned on my headlamp to organize my gear, then shut it off to let my eyes adjust. The bush became a layered darkness, full of shapes that shifted when I stared too long. I crawled in my tent early. The air cooled quickly. I lay on my back, listening. The ground noise continued for a while, then thinned out. Eventually, only insects remained. The leaf litter crackled now and then as something small passed through. It felt calm, familiar. I drifted off without trouble. Sometime during the night, a sound pulled me out of sleep. It was soft but distinct, a single plopping noise, dull and wet, like something heavy dropping on a soft ground. Not a crash, not a snap, just a muted impact. I lay still, listening for follow-up sounds. Nothing came. No movement, no rustling, no footsteps retreating. The bush went quiet again, aside from insects. I told myself it was nothing. A branch falling, an animal dropping something. My mind searched for normal explanations and found enough to settle on. I stayed still for a long time, listening hard. The ground cover made even small movements obvious. I heard nothing else. Eventually, sleep crept back in, shallow and uneasy. I woke again just before dawn. The light was gray and thin, seeping through the tent walls. The bush was still. No birds yet. That early quiet felt heavier than the night. I sat up slowly, my body stiff and cold. The memory of the sound from the night before came back sharp and clear. I unzipped the tent part way and leaned forward to grab my boots. That was when I saw it, right next to the tent entrance, close enough that I could have touched it without stepping outside, was a kangaroo's head. It lay on its side in the leaf litter. The fur was matted dark around the neck. The cut was clean but brutal, bone visible where the spine had been severed. One eye stared upward, glossy and open. The mouth hung slightly ajar, teeth exposed. Flies hadn't found it yet. It was fresh, very fresh. My first thought was that I was still half asleep, that my brain was assembling something wrong out of shadows and shapes. I stared at it, unmoving, waiting for it to become something else. It didn't. I knew with absolute certainty that it hadn't been there when I set up the tent. I had cleared that exact spot. I remembered the feel of the ground under my hands. There had been nothing there but sticks and leaves. My chest tightened. I scanned the area around the tent without stepping out. The head sat alone. No body nearby. No blood trail leading away. Just a head, placed deliberately close. The bush was silent. Too silent. Even the insects had gone quiet. I stayed inside the tent longer than I meant to, listening hard, forcing myself to breathe slowly. Every sense felt sharpened to a painful edge. I listened for footsteps, for the crack of sticks, for anything that suggested someone was still nearby. Nothing came. Eventually, the cold and fear pushed me to move. I reached for my boots and put them on inside the tent. My hands shook enough that it took effort. I packed what I could without leaving the tent fully, stuffing things into my bag blindly. I didn't care about order. I cared about leaving. When I finally unzipped the tent all the way and stepped out, the smell hit me. Metallic, thick, the scent of fresh blood mixed with eucalyptus. I avoided looking directly at the head again, but it sat in my peripheral vision no matter where I turned. I scanned the bush in every direction. The leaf litter stretched out undisturbed beyond the clearing. No obvious track stood out, but the ground was too cluttered to read easily. Whoever or whatever had placed the head there knew how noisy this place was. They would have known every step risked being heard. That was the part that chilled me most. The sound that woke me hadn't been footsteps, just that single plop. Whoever did it had moved carefully, slowly, close enough that they could place the head beside my tent without making noise. I finished packing in minutes. I didn't eat. I didn't take photos. I didn't investigate. I collapsed the tent fast, keeping my eyes up and scanning constantly. Every rustle in the distance made my muscles tense. I expected to see someone step out from behind a tree at any moment. No one did. As I walked back toward the trail, the bush began to wake up. Birds started calling. The normal sounds returned, indifferent and wrong in contrast to what I'd just seen. The head remained behind, a silent marker of the night. I didn't stop moving until I reached my car. I threw my pack in the back and drove away without looking back. My hand stayed tight on the wheel for the entire drive, every bend in the road making my pulse spike. Later, when the fear dulled enough to think clearly, I went over the possibilities. Kangaroos don't decapitate each other. Predators leave mess, drag marks, bodies torn apart. This was clean, intentional, the work of a person. Most likely someone hunting illegally, maybe spotlighting at night, cutting the head as a trophy, or to process the meat elsewhere. The placement mattered. It wasn't dropped at random. It was placed beside my tent, close enough to be found immediately. Whether it was meant as a warning, a threat, or some twisted joke didn't change the fact that someone had been in my camp while I slept. Someone quiet enough to move through that noisy ground without alerting me beyond a single sound I couldn't explain at the time. That realization stayed with me longer than the image itself. I wasn't alone out there. I had never been alone. I just hadn't known it until morning. I don't camp alone in places like that anymore. I choose busier areas or go with other people. The bush hasn't changed. It's still full of life and sound and beauty. But I learned that night that silence doesn't always mean safety, and some of the most disturbing things don't come with an explanation you can ever confirm. I went camping at Ginny Springs in Florida. I had been feeling burned out and wanted to escape for a few days, just me and the river and the trees. It was early April. The nights were still cool, but the days had a sticky warmth creeping through the air. I arrived in the late afternoon, carrying my small backpack and a modest tent, walking past the familiar line of oak and pine trees that framed the spring's entrance. The campground had a quiet rhythm, even with people scattered around setting up their sites, laughing, moving around, unloading coolers and folding chairs. I found a relatively isolated spot tucked back from the main path, where the shade from a large oak stretched across the soft, damp ground. I liked the isolation. I wanted the kind of quiet that pressed in, the kind that made every sound, the rustle of leaves, the hum of cicadas, feel sharp and deliberate. I set up my tent, pegging it securely in the ground, and carefully organized my gear inside. The smell of pine needles and damp earth was thick in the air, almost sweet, and it was enough to feel like I'd already left the rest of the world behind. The river wasn't far, a few minutes walk away, and I could hear it murmuring through the trees, a constant, low gurgle under the distant bird calls. The sun dipped lower, spreading golden light across the leaves, and the air cooled as shadows lengthened. By the time I ate a simple dinner of canned beans and crackers, night was falling. I had a small campfire not far from the tent, and I let it burn down to embers, the smell of smoke lingering in the quiet air. Everything felt calm. I went to bed earlier than usual, lying on my sleeping pad inside the tent. The canvas walls smelled faintly of damp fabric, and I could hear the subtle whisper of wind through the trees, the occasional snap of a twig somewhere nearby. At first, I couldn't tell if it was my imagination, but somewhere in the darkness, far off, there was a deep, resonant groan of wood straining. I dismissed it as the normal sounds of a forest settling at night. But then, unmistakably, there was the sound every movie and TV show ever dramatizes. The sudden, absolute crash of a huge tree collapsing. The ground seemed to shudder faintly beneath it, the air vibrating with the reverberation. I lay there frozen for a moment, heart skipping a beat, staring at the dark ceiling of the tent. The forest was silent again afterward, the cicadas and frogs picking up as if nothing had happened. I thought about it for a few seconds and told myself it was just a distant tree falling somewhere deeper in the woods. These things happen, I reasoned. Trees fall. That was all. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but the sound lingered in my mind, a low hum of unease. About 10 minutes later, movement outside caught my attention. At first, it was subtle, the crunch of footsteps on underbrush, murmurs that were hard to place. Then it grew louder, closer, the sound of many people talking at once, voices overlapping. I sat up, heart starting to pound, unzipped the tent, and stepped outside. The night air was damp and cool, pressing against my skin. My eyes took a moment to adjust to the darkness, but I could see the flicker of headlamps and flashlights moving through the trees. My stomach dropped. I followed the noise toward the cluster of people, realizing slowly what had happened. The huge crash I'd heard wasn't far from my campsite. A massive oak had fallen, and I could see the outline of another tent crushed beneath its trunk and limbs. The branches were thick, the trunk wide, and the way it had landed left no room inside the tent. A few people had gathered around, some trying to lift parts of the tree, but it was impossible. The scene was quiet except for the occasional soft cry, the shuffle of feet, and the low, tense murmurs of those gathered. I froze, my throat tight, stomach sinking, realizing there was no one moving inside that tent. I stepped closer, my flashlight revealing the true scale of it. The tree had split in its fall, the splintered wood jutting out like jagged teeth. Branches crushed the tent into a flattened heap. I couldn't look too long, but the realization hit me with a physical weight. Someone had died under that tree. Airlifting was already being coordinated. I could see the bright reflection of emergency lights moving through the trees, the occasional whoosh of a helicopter overhead as it hovered and prepared to lift the scene. The smell of crushed leaves and bark mixed with the humid Florida night. People were moving quickly, trying to cordon off the area to keep everyone else at a safe distance. I stayed nearby, almost attached, watching the process unfold. The helicopter's blades cut through the night air, a whirring that seemed impossibly loud compared to the subdued chaos on the ground. The paramedics and park rangers worked in a professional silence, carefully securing the body, the remnants of the tent, and the fallen tree. Even in the darkness, the devastation of the accident was evident. It was a quiet, horrifying scene, not like a dramatic movie crash, but like a sudden, brutal punctuation in an otherwise peaceful night. I moved back toward my own tent eventually, but I couldn't shake the image. The forest, which had felt so serene and calming just hours before, now carried a palpable tension. Every snapping twig, every distant rustle seemed amplified, loaded with menace. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The helicopter had left after the airlift, but the work crews lingered, clearing debris, making notes, keeping people away. In the pre-dawn hours, the first light revealed the jagged shadow of the fallen oak, a scar across the forest floor. The other campers were quiet, subdued, as if the whole place had absorbed the shock and refused to speak. I packed up quietly the next morning, the usual chatter and laughter of the day's arrivals feeling alien. The smell of pine and river water, normally comforting, now seemed heavy with the memory of the accident. I walked past the fallen tree one last time, noting how a part of the forest had changed overnight permanently. Life went on around it, of course. Birds sang, insects hummed, the river rippled as if nothing had happened. But I knew, and everyone involved knew, that sometimes the forest could change in an instant, and there was nothing anyone could do to prevent it. Driving away from Ginny Springs that morning, I felt a strange mix of relief and lingering dread. The campground looked cheerful in the daylight, families setting up chairs, kids running toward the water, the sun cutting through the trees. But I couldn't shake the quiet horror of that night, the awareness that a peaceful night could become something lethal in mere moments. It had nothing to do with ghosts or anything supernatural, just the raw, brutal force of nature. The thought stayed with me for years afterward, a reminder that even the most familiar, seemingly safe places could turn deadly without warning, and that life could hinge on the randomness of falling wood, a moment's misjudgment, or being in the wrong place at the wrong time. I still return to Florida sometimes, but I don't camp at Ginny Springs anymore. I stick to riverside parks with open grounds, places where I can see the sky and the trees, where I don't have to worry about an enormous oak deciding to end someone's life in an instant. That night changed the way I think about camping, about quiet forests, about the fragility of being alone in a place that seems safe until it isn't. The image of that crushed tent, the hush of people around it, and the hovering helicopter stays with me, the clearest reminder I've ever had that nature has a way of reminding us who's really in charge. My ex and I shared a birthday, and for years we celebrated it the same way. We went camping at Ginny Springs. It became a ritual. Same weekend every year, same general area near the water, same cheap tent that smelled faintly of river mud no matter how much we cleaned it. We told ourselves it was about tradition, but really it was about escaping everything else. No phones, no plans, no expectations beyond floating in the spring during the day and sitting by a fire at night. Ginny Springs always felt alive in a specific way. The water stayed cold no matter how brutal the Florida heat became. The trees crowded and close, thick and tangled, their branches knitting together overhead. During the day, the place was loud with people, laughter, music drifting from coolers. At night, that noise thinned out until it was replaced by insects, distant splashing, and the low, constant hum of the woods. That year, we arrived later than usual. The sun was already low, staining the sky orange and pink through the trees. We found a spot a little farther from the main paths than we normally did. It felt quieter there, more closed in. The ground was uneven, littered with pine needles and small roots that made setting up the tent awkward. We managed anyway, hammering stakes into soil that felt damp and compacted. The air was thick, heavy with humidity, carrying the smell of stagnant water and crushed leaves. By the time we finished setting up, darkness was settling fast. We skipped swimming and ate quickly, sitting on the ground near a small fire. The flames barely pushed back the dark. Beyond the firelight, the forest felt endless. Sounds traveled strangely there. A snapped branch could sound close one moment and far the next. We went to bed not long after. The tent trapped heat, and the air inside felt stale. I lay on my back, staring up at the mesh ceiling, watching shadows from the trees sway slowly as the wind moved through them. Somewhere in the distance, something splashed in the water. Frogs started their steady chorus. Everything felt normal, familiar. Sometime later, I woke up without knowing why. The kind of waking where your body reacts before your brain catches up. The air felt tense, like the pressure before a storm. I listened, holding still. Then it came. A scream tore through the night. It was high and sharp, raw in a way that made my chest tighten instantly. It wasn't human. It didn't sound like any animal noise I recognized right away either. It cut through the darkness and echoed, bouncing off trees, lingering longer than it should have. Before I could fully process it, the sound came again, louder, followed by a deep, rough growl that vibrated low in the ground. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my neck. The scream came again, overlapping with the growling now, the two sounds colliding and feeding into each other. Whatever was making them was close. Too close. It felt like it was right outside the tent, just beyond the thin fabric separating us from the dark. I lay there frozen, every muscle tight. The logical part of my brain tried to identify the sounds, cycling through possibilities. Coyotes sometimes screamed like that, but the growling felt heavier. More solid. Bears didn't live there. That left mountain lions, which everyone said weren't around, but which everyone also secretly believed could be. The sounds fit what I'd heard in videos. Screams that sounded almost human. Low, territorial growls. The noises intensified. Leaves rustled violently. Something moved fast through the brush, circling, stopping, circling again. The ground vibrated with sudden movement. The screaming rose into a frantic pitch, then dropped in short, broken bursts, as if whatever was making it was lunging or retreating. The growling responded, steady and threatening. I could barely breathe. Every instinct told me not to move, not to make noise, not to draw attention. The tent suddenly felt useless. Thin fabric, plastic poles, nothing that would stop an animal if it decided to come through. Minutes stretched out. The sounds continued, relentless. The screaming echoed, bounced, then cut off abruptly, replaced by a furious series of growls and snorts. Something brushed against the side of the tent. The fabric shifted slightly, just enough to make my stomach drop. I imagined claws, teeth, weight pressing down. I pictured the tent collapsing inward, poles snapping, fabric tearing. My mind filled in details faster than I could stop it. Eventually, the sounds paused. Not silence, but a lull. Heavy breathing, subtle movement, leaves crunching slowly now, deliberately. I lay there, counting my breaths, waiting for the next burst. That was when I realized I couldn't stay still anymore. The not knowing was worse than the fear. My body buzzed with adrenaline. I needed to see something, anything. Slowly, carefully I shifted. The tent creaked softly. I winced and froze, waiting to see if the sounds would explode again. They didn't. I gathered what courage I'd left and pushed myself up onto my knees. The mesh ceiling above me showed fragments of the night sky, stars faint behind drifting clouds. I raised myself inch by inch, heart hammering so loud I was sure it could be heard outside. When I finally lifted my head enough to see past the tent wall, I looked through the mesh, bracing myself for glowing eyes, for a massive shape moving in the dark. What I saw took a second to register. A small, thin house cat stood a few feet away from the tent. Its fur was puffed up, back-arched, tail stiff and bristled. Its mouth was open wide, teeth bared, emitting the same horrifying scream that had convinced me something huge was stalking us. Across from it, no more than 2 feet away, was an armadillo. The armadillo stood frozen, half-curled, its armored body reflecting faint moonlight. It shifted slightly, claws scraping the dirt. The cat lunged forward suddenly, screaming again, then jumped back just as fast. The armadillo responded by snapping its jaws and making a low, mechanical-sounding growl, a sound that, amplified by the night, had become monstrous in my head. They circled each other slowly, locked in a standoff that felt absurd and terrifying at the same time. The cat screamed again, louder than before, the sound echoing off the trees. The armadillo huffed and shuffled sideways, bumping into leaves, causing the rustling that had sounded like something massive charging through the brush. I stayed there, frozen in disbelief, watching the entire scene play out. My fear didn't vanish instantly. My body didn't know how to shut it off yet. My hand shook, my pulse stayed high, but the realization settled in slowly, grounding everything. This wasn't a predator hunt. It wasn't a fight for territory. It was a stray cat, terrified and aggressive, facing an equally confused armadillo that had wandered into the wrong place. The tension broke when the armadillo suddenly turned and waddled off into the darkness, disappearing into the brush with surprising speed. The cat let out one final scream, then darted in the opposite direction, vanishing just as quickly as it had appeared. The forest settled back into itself. Frogs resumed their chorus. Insects buzzed. The air felt still again. I lower myself back down slowly, my muscles aching from how tight I'd been holding them. The tent felt solid again, familiar, safe. The fear drained out of me in waves, replaced by shaky relief and a strange sense of embarrassment. I didn't sleep much after that. Every small sound made my body tense, but nothing else happened. Morning came quietly, light filtering through the trees, revealing nothing out of place. No tracks near the tent, no signs of the chaos that had consumed the night. Years later, the memory still sticks with me. Not because it was funny, though it became that in hindsight, but because of how real the fear was in the moment. How quickly the mind fills in the worst possibilities when you're surrounded by darkness and unfamiliar sounds. That night at Jenny Springs reminded me how thin the line is between calm and panic, and how nature doesn't need anything supernatural to feel terrifying. Sometimes all it takes is a stray cat, an armored animal, and a forest that amplifies every sound until your imagination does the rest. I went camping alone during a stretch when I needed quiet more than comfort. The site was a simple pull-in spot near a bend in the river, far enough from the main campground that the trees closed in and swallowed sound. The ground was hard and dry, ringed by stones from fires long gone. Ash clung to the dirt in thin gray patches. The place had been used often, but it felt empty when I arrived, like it was holding its breath. I set up my tent before dark. The air smelled of pine sap and old smoke. The river moved slow and steady, a constant low rush that made time feel less sharp. I made my own fire as the light faded, keeping it small, just enough to push back the dark. I cooked, ate, and sat watching the flames until my eyes burned. Nothing felt wrong. Nothing stood out. Night settled in fully. The forest sounds layered themselves into a pattern I recognized. Insects clicked. Leaves shifted now and then. I crawled in my tent and fell asleep quickly. I woke before dawn, cold and stiff. The sky was still dark, but the black had softened into gray. I unzipped the tent to step out and build the fire back up. That was when the smell hit me. It wasn't the clean scent of wood smoke. It was thick and wrong, heavy in the air. My body reacted before my mind did. I froze halfway out of the tent, heart starting to pound. The smell clung to the back of my throat. I stood slowly and looked toward the fire ring. Someone was there. At first, my brain refused to accept it. The shape near the pit didn't move. It looked like a pile of gear or a dark bundle left behind. I took a few careful steps closer, every sense screaming that something was off. The smell grew stronger. The fire pit wasn't cold. The stones were blackened, still warm enough that faint heat shimmered above them. In the center was a body. The person lay slumped forward, close to the ashes. The position was unnatural, heavy in a way that told me immediately this wasn't sleep. Clothing was burned and stiff. The scene was quiet in a way that pressed in on my ears. No birds, no insects, just a river, still moving, still indifferent. I stopped moving. My legs fell hollow. My hands shook without permission. I couldn't make myself look for long, but I saw enough to understand what had happened. This wasn't an accident. There was no sign of struggle, no scattered gear, no attempt to put the fire out. The reality settled in slow and brutal. Someone had come here alone and chosen this place as the end. I backed away until my calves hit the edge of my tent. I sat down hard, breathing shallow, trying not to panic. The smell clung to everything. It felt like it had soaked into my clothes, my skin. I checked my phone, even though I already knew. No service. The bar stayed empty. The isolation I had wanted now felt dangerous and wrong. I forced myself to think clearly. I packed only what I needed, moving fast but careful, keeping my eyes down. Every movement felt loud. Every sound echoed. I avoided looking at the fire pit again, but the presence of it pulled at my awareness no matter where I stood. When I finally got into my car, my hands were slick with sweat. I drove until I found signal, then pulled over. My body shook as the adrenaline drained out, leaving behind a deep, sick exhaustion. Authorities arrived later. I waited nearby, wrapped in a jacket I didn't remember grabbing. The forest filled again with sound as the day warmed. Birds called. Wind moved through branches. Life went on around the site, unchanged. I learned later that the person had been reported missing. There were no signs of anyone else involved. No notes found. Just a quiet choice made in a quiet place. I don't camp alone anymore. Not because I think something like that will happen again, but because the memory follows me. The way the fire pit looked at dawn. The smell that didn't belong. The understanding that the wilderness can hold more than animals and weather. It can hold human pain left behind without warning. That morning taught me that horror doesn't always come from fear of being hunted or attacked. Sometimes it comes from stumbling into the final moment of someone else's life and carrying the weight of it long after the forest has moved on. I went camping with my friends back in high school during a time when none of us understood our limits and all of us believed exhaustion was something you could ignore. We picked a stretch of woods deep in the mountains, far from any maintained campground. The trailhead was small, barely marked, and the path climbed steadily from the moment we stepped onto it. Trees closed in fast. The air thinned as we gained elevation. Every step pulled a little more strength out of our legs. We hiked for hours. Packs dug into our shoulders. Sweat soaked through our shirts and dried again in patches. We stopped talking after a while, saving our breath, just following the person ahead of us. The woods felt endless. The light shifted slowly through the canopy, turning from bright to muted without any clear signal of time passing. By the time we found a clearing flat enough to camp, the sun was already sliding low. We dropped our packs without ceremony. No one scouted much. No one cared. We were tired past the point of caution. Tents went up crooked. Stakes were hammered into rocky soil at bad angles. Sleeping bags were thrown inside without being unrolled properly. We ate quickly, barely tasting anything, then crawled into our tents as the light faded completely. The forest changed after dark. Sounds grew sharper. The air cooled fast, settling into our clothes and skin. I lay on my back inside my tent, muscles aching in a deep, dull way. My breathing slowed. I felt the ground through the thin pad beneath me. The smell of dirt and pine filled the small space. I fell asleep almost immediately. Something pulled me out of sleep later, slow and gradual, like surfacing from deep water. At first, I couldn't place what was wrong. My body was heavy. My mind felt thick. Then I heard it, a sound just outside the tent. Not loud, not sudden. A careful step, leaves shifting, a soft crunch, deliberate and close. I held my breath and listened. Another sound followed, then another. Each one came from a different direction. Whatever was moving wasn't passing through. It was circling. The sounds were slow and controlled, not the chaotic scurry of small animals. The steps were spaced, measured, as if something was testing the ground before committing its weight. My heart started a race. I lay completely still, staring at the dark fabric inches from my face. The tent felt smaller than it had earlier. The thin walls suddenly seemed meaningless. I strained to hear my friends, any movement from their tents. Nothing. The woods swallowed every sound except the ones creeping closer to me. More steps came, all around now. To my left, behind my head, near my feet. The leaf litter cracked under pressure, then went quiet again. The pattern felt intentional. Encircling, I imagined shapes moving just beyond the edge of sight, stopping, listening, repositioning. My thoughts spiraled. I tried to tell myself it was animals, but my brain refused to accept anything harmless. The height of the sounds was wrong. Too high, not close to the ground. These steps came from something tall, something upright. I imagined figures standing just outside, heads tilted, waiting. I became aware of my own breathing, shallow and fast, sounding loud inside the tent. I forced myself to slow it down. Every instinct told me not to move, not to draw attention. The sounds paused, as if responding to the change. Then they resumed, closer than before. Fear settled into my chest like a weight. My mouth went dry. I thought about the distance we had hiked, how far we were from any road. I thought about how tired we were, how helpless we would be if something happened. The idea of opening the tent felt impossible, but staying blind felt worse. I reached slowly for my flashlight, careful not to let it clatter against anything. My hand shook as I wrapped my fingers around it. The sounds outside stopped again, creating a silence so complete it rang in my ears. I sat up inch by inch, my body stiff, listening for any reaction. Nothing. I took a breath and unzipped the tent just enough to see out. Cold air slid inside. The forest beyond was pitch black, thick with shadows layered over shadows. I raised the flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness in a narrow cone. Immediately, points of light reflected back at me. Dozens of them, all around the tent. They hovered at nearly the same height as my own eyes, some higher, some lower, but none close to the ground. They were spaced evenly, unmoving, watching. My heart slammed against my ribs. For a split second, my mind filled in shapes behind the eyes. Tall bodies, long limbs, faces just out of reach of the light. The stillness made it worse. Nothing ran. Nothing flinched. The eyes stayed locked on me, calm and alert. I swung the beam slowly, my hand barely obeying me. More eyes appeared as the light moved, extending the circle farther into the trees. The ground beneath them was uneven, littered with leaves and branches, but the eyes floated steady above it all. I felt trapped, surrounded, exposed. The tent behind me offered no protection. The darkness beyond the beam felt endless. I considered waking my friends, but the thought of breaking the silence felt dangerous, like an invitation. I held the light steady and forced myself to look harder, to actually see. Shapes began to form at the edges of the beam. Slender legs, narrow chests, long necks stretching upward. The eyes blinked, the reflections shifting as heads turned slightly. They were deer, a whole herd of them, standing quietly around our camp, curious and unafraid. Their bodies blended into the darkness so completely that only their eyes betrayed them. They were taller than I had ever imagined deer could be, especially standing that close, their heads held high, ears flicking toward every small sound. The realization didn't erase the fear immediately. My body stayed tense, adrenaline still flooding my system. But the sharp edge dulled. The shapes resolved into something familiar. Harmless. The sounds made sense now. The careful steps, the circling. They had wandered into our camp while we slept, drawn by scent or curiosity, moving cautiously but without malice. I lowered the flashlight slightly. Some of the deer shifted their weight. One stepped back, hooves cracking softly against dry leaves. Another turned its head, eyes flashing as the angle changed. None of them bolted. None seemed alarmed. We were just another strange object in their path. After a moment, one of them moved away, melting back into the trees. Another followed. Slowly, the circle loosened. The eyes drifted farther apart, then disappeared one by one as the herd continued on through the forest. I sat there long after they were gone, the flashlight still on, listening to the woods return to normal. My hands trembled as the adrenaline drained away, leaving behind a deep exhaustion and a lingering unease. I zipped the tent shut and lay back down, staring into the darkness again, but it no longer felt quite as threatening. Morning came eventually. Sunlight filtered through the trees, revealing the clearing in full. Hoof prints covered the ground around our tents, pressed deep into the soil, crossing and overlapping in every direction. Seeing them in daylight drove home how close they had been, how many of them there were. We packed up later that morning and hiked out, tired in a different way than the day before. I didn't mention the night right away. The fear had been too personal, too raw. Even knowing what it was didn't erase how real it had felt in the moment. Years later, I still remember the way those eyes looked in the dark, floating at my height, silent and unblinking. I know now how easily the mind fills in gaps when you're exhausted and surrounded by unfamiliar sounds. I know how something ordinary can turn terrifying when stripped of context. That night taught me respect for the woods, not because of monsters or threats, but because of how quickly they can overwhelm your senses and your reason, leaving you alone with your imagination until the truth finally steps into the light. My siblings and I went camping during a summer when we thought weather was just another obstacle you worked around. We were young enough to feel confident and careless, old enough to believe we could judge risk on our own. The campground sat beside a wide lake, surrounded by low hills and scattered trees. It was a place we had visited before, familiar enough that we didn't think twice about staying the night, even when the forecast hinted at storms. The day started warm and heavy. The air felt thick, like it was pressing down on everything. Clouds stacked up in the distance, tall and bright, white at first, then slowly turning darker at their bases. We noticed it, but not enough to worry. We swam in the lake, cooked food, laughed, and moved through the hours without urgency. The wind was calm. The water barely rippled. By late afternoon, the light shifted. The sky lost its brightness and took on a flat, gray tone that made everything look muted. The lake darkened, reflecting the clouds like dull metal. The air smelled sharp and wet, even though no rain had fallen yet. Birds disappeared from the shoreline. The quiet felt staged, like the pause before something heavy dropped. We set up the tent close to the water, driving the stakes deep and checking the lines. It felt solid. The fabric snapped lightly in a growing breeze, but nothing alarming. We cooked dinner and ate fast as the first distant thunder rolled across the lake. It sounded low and hollow, like something massive turning over in the distance. The storm didn't arrive all at once. It crept closer, thunder growing louder, flashes of lightning appearing farther out over the water. At first, the lightning looked beautiful, branching and slow, crawling through the clouds instead of striking down. The lake reflected every flash, doubling the effect, making the sky and water feel like one endless surface of light and shadow. Then the rain started. It came hard and sudden, fat drops slamming into the tent and ground. The wind picked up at the same time, pushing against the fabric in uneven bursts. The thunder lost its gaps. It became a constant roar, layered and deep, like the sky was tearing itself apart. Lightning slammed into the lake again and again, striking so close the flashes left white shapes burned into my vision. Inside the tent, everything felt smaller. The walls bowed inward with every gust. The sound of rain on fabric was deafening. Wind howled through the trees, bending branches until they creaked and snapped. The ground vibrated with thunder, so close it felt physical, like pressure against my chest. The tent started to lift. At first it was subtle, a light tug upward that made the poles flex. Then it happened again, stronger. The stakes groaned. The rain blew sideways now, forcing its way through seams and soaking everything. The roar outside became constant, a solid wall of sound with no breaks. We realized the tent wasn't going to hold. The wind came in violent surges, lifting one side of the tent clear off the ground before slamming it back down. Each time it happened, the fabric snapped and strained. Lightning struck somewhere close enough that the flash lit the inside of the tent like daylight, followed instantly by a crack so loud it left my ears ringing. We scrambled, grabbing what we could, crawling out into the storm. The rain hit like thrown gravel. The wind shoved us sideways, making it hard to stay upright. The lake was chaos now, waves crashing into the shore, spray lifting off the surface and blowing inland. We ran for the car. The short distance felt endless. Wind tore at our clothes. Debris flew past, leaves and small branches whipping through the air. By the time we reached the car, we were soaked and shaking, hands numb as we pulled the doors open and piled inside. The car rocked as soon as we shut the doors. Not gently. It shook in sharp, violent motions, the suspension creaking under the force of the wind. Rain hammered the roof, so hard it sounded like metal being pelted with stones. Lightning flashed constantly now, turning the world outside into a series of frozen frames. Through the windshield, we watched the tent collapse. One moment it stood, bent and straining. The next, a gust flattened it completely, ripping the stakes from the ground. The fabric twisted, poles snapping or folding in on themselves. Another surge of wind lifted the entire thing and threw it sideways into a nearby tree, where it tangled and wrapped around branches like shredded cloth. The sight hit me harder than the storm itself. That tent had been our shelter minutes before. Seeing it destroyed so easily drove home how little protection it had really offered. The car lurched again, rocking hard enough that I worried it might tip. The wind screamed around us, a high, constant howl layered over the thunder. Trees bent low, their crowns whipping back and forth. Somewhere nearby, something heavy fell with a deep crash that I felt through the seat. Staying there stopped feeling like an option. We pulled out, headlights cutting through sheets of rain. Driving was slow and tense. The road was slick, water pooling in low spots. Wind pushed the car sideways, forcing constant correction. Branches littered the pavement. The lake disappeared behind us as we climbed away from the campground, thunder following close the entire way. The drive to my grandpa's house felt longer than it was. Every mile, I expected something worse. Another fallen tree, a power line. The storm didn't let up. Lightning still filled the sky, thunder shaking the car even as we moved farther away. When we finally arrived, the house stood dark but solid. The walls didn't move. The roof didn't flex. Stepping inside felt unreal, like crossing into a different world. The storm raged outside, but the sound was muted, distant. I didn't sleep much that night. Every crack of thunder brought the memory of the tent lifting, the car shaking. The next morning, the storm was gone. The air was cool and clean, washed clear by the rain. The sky was pale blue, scattered with harmless clouds. It felt wrong, like nothing bad could have happened under such calm. We drove back to the campground to see what was left. Parts of it were closed off. Trees lay across access roads, trunks snapped or uprooted, roots torn out of the ground and coated in mud. Park staff moved around, surveying damage. The lake was calm again, its surface smooth and reflective, betraying no sign of the violence from the night before. We reached our site and took stock. The tent was ruined, twisted beyond saving. Gear was scattered or soaked. Some things were missing entirely. One of the neighboring areas was taped off, damage heavier there, trees down in a rough line that cut through several campsites. We learned later that a small tornado had gone through the campground sometime during the night. Whether it was during the worst of what we experienced or just after, we couldn't tell. From the damage, it looked close. Too close for comfort. We cleaned up what we could. There was no point staying. As we packed, I noticed something else missing. My sleeping bag was gone. Not torn, not buried, just gone. Likely carried off by the wind, lifted and thrown somewhere into the trees or the lake. I never found it. We left the campground for good that morning, tired in a way that had nothing to do with hiking or lack of sleep. The storm had stripped away any illusion that we were in control. It showed us how fast things could turn, how small a tent was against wind and lightning, how easily a night could become dangerous without warning. I have seen storms since then, heavy rain and loud thunder, but nothing like that one. Nothing that made the ground feel unstable, the air feel alive with force. That night stays with me. The endless roar, the lightning crawling through the sky, the feeling of being one mistake away from something much worse. And every time I think about it, I remember the empty space where my sleeping bag should have been, taken by the storm without a trace. A small reminder of how completely it overwhelmed everything we brought with us. We like to hike deep into Georgia, far enough that the woods stopped feeling recreational and started feeling indifferent. 3 to 5 miles down a trailhead was our usual range. Far enough that casual hikers dropped off, far enough that the sounds of roads vanished, far enough that once you committed, turning back felt like work. The land out there rolled gently, thick with pine and hardwood, the ground layered with needles and leaves that softened every step. The air always smelled damp and earthy, even in dry weather. That trip was supposed to be routine. Mid-fall, cool nights, mild days. We packed light, expecting nothing worse than a chill after sunset. The hike-in went smooth. The woods were quiet but not empty. Squirrels darted through the trees. Birds lifted off as we passed. The trail narrowed as we went, fading into packed dirt and leaf cover. By the time we chose a spot to camp, the light was already thinning. We set up near a small clearing, not far from Shallow Creek. The ground was flat enough, sheltered by trees on all sides. We gathered wood while there was still light, stacking it high. The temperature dropped fast once the sun disappeared. Faster than expected. The air sharpened, biting at exposed skin. Our breath started showing earlier than it should have. By full dark, it was cold in a way that didn't match the season. The kind of cold that settled deep instead of hovering on the surface. Later we would learn it dropped into the low 20s that night, which was rare for that time of year. Out there, with no forecast and no signal, it just felt wrong. We built the fire big, not a cautious, efficient fire, but a solid one that threw heat in every direction. Flames climbed high, cracking and popping as sap burned off the logs. The light pushed back the darkness, carving the woods into a circle of visibility. Outside that circle, everything vanished into black. We ate until we were heavy and warm. The combination of heat and a full stomach worked fast. The fire roared steadily, and the cold stayed back. One by one, we drifted off where we sat or lay, too tired to bother crawling into proper sleeping positions. The woods faded into background noise, the fire into a steady presence. I don't know how long I slept before something touched my foot. At first, it barely registered. A gentle pressure, then a tap. My body reacted before my mind caught up. I stiffened, heart jumping, breath caught in my chest. The cold had crept in while I slept, seeping through layers, making my joints ache. I opened my eyes slowly. My buddy was crouched near me, barely moving. He didn't speak. He didn't make a sound. He lifted his chin slightly, pointing with his eyes toward the fire. I followed his gaze. The fire had burned down to thick coals, glowing dull red beneath a crust of ash. The flames were mostly gone, just an occasional flicker licking upward before dying. In that low light, shapes moved. 2 wild boar stood near the fire ring. They were close, much closer than anything that large should ever be. Their bodies were massive and solid, bristled backs catching the faint glow from the coals. Dirt sprayed as they rooted at the ground with their snouts, tearing up earth and leaves where we had been sitting not long before. Their movements were slow but powerful, deliberate in a way that made them feel dangerous without effort. I felt the fear settle into my gut, heavy and immediate. My muscles locked. My breathing went shallow on instinct. Every sound felt amplified. The scrape of tusks against dirt, the low huff of breath from their nostrils, the crackle of a coal shifting under their hooves. Wild boar in Georgia are not small animals. These were easily over 100 pounds each, thick with muscle and bone. They were known for being aggressive, unpredictable, and fast. They didn't need a reason to charge. They didn't bluff. If spooked, they went straight through whatever stood in front of them. We had nothing within reach. Our packs were a few feet away, but might as well have been miles. The only tool we had that night was a hand axe, and it lay beyond the fire ring, closer to the boar than to us. Reaching for it would have been suicide. I lay completely still, my body pressed into the cold ground, every nerve screaming not to move. My buddy did the same. Neither of us dared shift our weight or turn our heads more than necessary. Even the sound of fabric moving felt too loud in my mind. The boar continued to root around the fire, clearly interested in the disturbed ground and lingering smells. They circled slowly, hooves crunching softly over leaves and dirt. One moved closer, so close I could see the curve of its tusk catch the glow from the coals. Its eye reflected dull and dark, unreadable. Time stretched in a way I had never experienced before. Minutes felt like hours. Every second dragged, thick and heavy. The cold seeped deeper, but I barely noticed. Fear kept me locked in place, hyper-aware of every detail. The smell of earth, the faint smoke still clinging to the air, the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. At one point, one of the boar lifted its head and stood still. Its ears twitched. I was sure it had sensed us. I was sure it would charge. My mind raced through useless plans. Curl into a ball. Try to roll away. Protect the neck. None of it mattered. Against an animal like that, on the ground, unarmed, there were no good options. But it didn't charge. It dropped its head again and went back to rooting. Dirt sprayed over the coals, dimming their glow. The fire shrank further, its light fading with every minute. The darkness crept closer, swallowing the clearing bit by bit. We lay there for what felt like an entire night, though it was probably closer to an hour. Neither of us moved. Not a finger, not a foot. The cold numbed my extremities, but I didn't dare shift to relieve it. The boar remained, circling, digging, occasionally bumping into each other with low grunts. Eventually, the fire died completely. The last ember winked out, and the clearing fell into full darkness. The boar paused, confused by the loss of heat and light. They snorted, shuffled, then slowly moved away, their heavy bodies fading into the trees with soft, crunching steps. We stayed still long after the sounds disappeared. Only when the woods settled back into silence did I allow myself to breathe fully again. My chest ached from holding tension for so long. My muscles trembled as the adrenaline drained away, leaving behind cold and exhaustion. We didn't rebuild the fire that night. We didn't sleep much either. We waited for the first hint of gray light, then packed up fast, hands stiff and clumsy from the cold. The hike out felt longer than usual, every shadow making my nerves twitch. Looking back, I know how close we came to something irreversible. Wild boar don't hesitate when threatened. A sudden movement, a cough, a shift of weight could have been enough. We were lucky in a way that had nothing to do with skill or preparation. Pure chance. The fire kept them curious instead of aggressive. Our stillness kept us from being noticed as a threat. That night changed how I think about the woods. Not because of monsters or myths, but because of how fast comfort can turn into danger. How easily a quiet night can put you inches from an animal that could end your life without effort. The memory of those bristled shapes moving through dying firelight stays with me. A reminder that out there, survival sometimes depends on doing absolutely nothing at all. My time in the Army put me in the woods more than any other place. Upstate New York became familiar in a way few people understand. Not the postcard version with fall colors and quiet lakes, but the version you live in when you sleep on the ground, eat cold food, and wake up damp no matter how dry the forecast promised. The terrain was thick with hardwoods, uneven ground, and leaf litter that never fully dried. The air always carried a smell of rot and moss. Even on clear nights, the woods felt closed in. We trained year-round. Seasons blurred together. Summer brought bugs and sweat. Fall brought cold rain and fog that clung to everything. Winter stripped the forest bare and made sound travel far. At night, the woods never went silent. They shifted, creaked, and breathed. You learned to sort those sounds fast. Wind through branches. Small animals moving through leaves. Larger animals pacing at a distance. Anything out of rhythm grabbed your attention. Sleep came in short pieces. You learned to doze without fully relaxing. Gear stayed on or within reach. Body armor became a pillow. Pouches stayed zipped. Everything had a place because losing anything meant explaining it later, and explanations were never fun. The first time it happened, I thought I was dreaming. I was half asleep. The kind of sleep where you're aware of your body, but not fully awake. I felt a tug near my chest. Light pressure, a slow pull. My mind tried to make sense of it without opening my eyes. I thought maybe a strap shifted. Maybe I rolled onto something wrong. Then I felt a sharp, precise movement. Something small, but strong working at a zipper. I snapped awake. The woods were dark, just a faint gray from the sky, filtering through bare branches. I stayed still, listening. The movement continued, a soft metallic rasp, controlled, deliberate, not random scratching, not the frantic noise of an animal panicking. I tilted my head down slowly and saw a shape crouched on my chest. A raccoon. Its face was inches from my body armor. Black eyes locked on the pouch it was working on. Its paws moved with purpose, fingers pressing, pulling, manipulating the zipper tab like it had done it before. I didn't move. Startling, it could end with teeth in my neck or gear scattered everywhere. The raccoon opened the pouch and immediately reached inside. It pulled out a protein bar, sniffed it, and dropped it beside me like trash. Then it reached back in. I stayed frozen, watching in disbelief as it emptied my kit piece by piece. Not clawing, not tearing, just opening, removing, evaluating. Its whiskers twitched. Its nose worked constantly. It knew what it wanted. Behind it, I noticed movement. Another raccoon sat a few feet away, upright on its haunches, watching the tree line. Still, alert, its head turned slowly, scanning. It looked less interested in food and more interested in awareness. That was when the fear hit. Not panic, something colder. A realization that this wasn't a random animal encounter. This felt practiced. I didn't move until the raccoon on my chest finished. It zipped the pouch shut, clean. Then it climbed off me without rushing and padded away into the leaves, carrying something small and metallic in its mouth. I lay there staring at the sky, heart pounding, trying to understand what had just happened. The next morning, my kit was lighter, missing small items, snacks, a multi-tool, nothing mission critical, but enough to matter. I chalked it up to bad luck and told myself animals learn fast around people. That explanation felt thin, but it was easier than admitting how controlled it had felt. It happened again a week later. Different site, same forest, same routine. This time I woke to pressure near my waist. Fingers again, working a buckle. I opened my eyes slowly and saw two raccoons this time. One on me, one beside my pack. Both working in sync. One focused on my body armor. The other already had my pack open, removing items and setting them aside like inventory. Further out, barely visible, sat a larger raccoon. It was noticeably bigger than the others. Thicker body, broader head. It sat still, facing outward back to the group. It did not forage. It did not touch anything. It watched. The smaller raccoons moved in and out of the light, bringing items to a spot near the large one. The large raccoon sniffed some things, nudged others aside with its paw. When it shifted, the others adjusted without hesitation. I stayed still, barely breathing. My skin crawled, not because raccoons are dangerous in the usual sense, but because this felt wrong. Too organized, too calm, too aware. When they finished, they moved off together. The large one stood last, lingering a moment longer. It turned its head slightly in my direction. Its eyes reflected faint light. It didn't look surprised to see me awake. It looked aware. After that night, I stopped sleeping deeply. I secured my gear tighter, double-checked zippers, hung packs when possible. It didn't matter. They adapted. Straps were loosened, buckles undone, pouches opened. They learned faster than we adjusted. I started waking before they reached me. I would hear them approach. The leaves barely moved. Footsteps were spaced, measured. Not the chaotic scuttle of wildlife. More like a patrol. I never tried to scare them off. Instinct told me not to. These animals had learned boundaries and consequences. They knew when to retreat and when to press. They never attacked, never showed aggression. They took what they wanted and left. Over time, I realized something unsettling. They never took the same things twice. Food went first, shiny items second, anything with scent. They avoided things that had no use. They avoided items that might cause trouble. No blades, no loud objects, no sudden surprises. The large raccoon always stayed back, always watching. It never touched my gear. It never panicked. It never rushed. The others deferred to it without question. Eventually, I started packing differently. I accepted losses as inevitable. I wrapped food in sealed containers. I accepted that some nights, I would wake lighter than I fell asleep. The last night it happened was the clearest. Cold air, thin frost on the leaves. I woke before they reached me. I lay there and watched as they emerged from the dark one by one. 3 smaller raccoons, then the large one. They moved into position like they had done it 100 times. One climbed on my chest, another went for my pack. The third stayed near my boots. The large one sat back, overseeing everything. I watched them work. I saw how they communicated without sound. Small shifts, pauses, head tilts. They responded to each other instantly. When they finished, the large raccoon stood and turned fully toward me. It held my gaze for several seconds. Then it turned away and led the others back into the woods. That was the last time. After that rotation ended, I was reassigned. Different terrain, different forests. I never saw anything like it again. Years later, people laugh when I talk about raccoons unzipping gear. They picture clumsy animals knocking over trash cans. They don't picture coordinated movement, planning, restraint. I do. I still check my pockets when I wake in the woods. Even now, even knowing I'm not there anymore. Some habits stay because they kept you safe. Some memories stay because they remind you that intelligence doesn't always look like people expect.